We are back here on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast to talk some more about Hard Knocks and specifically about the episode that just dropped this week, episode 3 to be exact. Dropped a couple of days ago, as it usually does on Tuesdays, and this episode went more into depth on the development of Saquon in free agency, all the news that they were hearing about the Chicago Bears potentially being interested, the Eagles being interested, and then at one point not believing that the Eagles were going to get him. It all went down really on this episode. Then it moved on afterwards with them going into potentially acquiring Brian Burns, then also Devin Singletary. It all went really into the next processes after Saquon eventually joined the Eagles, right? But I wanted to focus in on the last conversation that you hear between Joe Schoen, the Giants general manager, and Ed Berry, who is Saquon Barkley's agent. On this episode, they had a back and forth, and with also some comments made by owner John Mara, who, obviously, if you watched the first couple of episodes, you would have known that he was really against getting rid of Saquon Barkley. All his interactions, I don't want to laugh and just say it was funny, because you do feel bad for him, because he said at one point that Saquon is and has been their most popular player in a long time. And even in this interaction between Joe Schoen and the process of moving on from Saquon, just admitting that they were going to lose him eventually, owner John Mara said that at one point he'd have a tough time sleeping if Saquon goes to Philly. I'll tell you that, as I've told you, just being around enough players, he's the most popular player we have by far. So you can see the real love right there that John Mara has for Saquon, and obviously how it always plays out, Saquon moves on, and the way John Mara was so defeated by it, it just resembled all Giants fans really once they heard the news of Saquon moving on. But on this interaction with Joe Schoen and Ed Berry, it was really interesting because you see how close the Giants really were to matching the Eagles on their offer, but it was the hesitancy to pull the plug, to pull the trigger from Joe Schoen that ultimately, I mean, you could see it from past episodes before, but this really just put the final nail on the coffin in admitting defeat in the pursuit of Saquon. So the first thing that they mentioned or that they had a conversation about was between Ed Berry and Joe Schoen. Joe Schoen just going over what Ed Berry had said to him at first by saying, okay, so that's, if I offered him today, 3-year deal at 12.5 APY and $25 million guaranteed, he'd be a Giant? Okay, all right, well, I'll give you a call back. This may be above me on Saquon, but if I call you back and it's 3 for 12.5 APY and 25 guaranteed, there you go. We'll bring him down today. We'll fly you up, do a press conference, and that's what Joe Schoen had in his mind. It looked like the agreement, right? If Joe Schoen, who said that statement, if they had agreed to that, he was starting to feel that, based on what Ed Berry told him, that Saquon could have a good chance of staying as a New York Giant. And if you look at that, $12.5 million per year, 25 guaranteed, I think the Eagles gave him about 12.75 at $37.75 million per year and $26 million guaranteed. We're only talking about a few numbers off there in terms of the whole package and guaranteed money. So it was really just the margin of how close this contract was, almost identical to what he got from the Eagles. So it was right there for the Giants. It was right there. If they were really planning on offering them that, they probably would have had a good chance of doing so. But you already heard some of the hesitancy when he said, I'll give you a call back. This may be above me on Saquon. You could notice his hesitancy there, plus what he was feeling, his body language before, and just the conversations they had in episodes 1 and 2 about being overly confident that nobody was going to pay market price for Saquon. Then you have this interaction, and then the conversations also with John Mara talking about how you have to see what Daniel Jones has to at least, play out this year, give him a chance. And then with how that goes and now more of these actions leading into episode 3, the biggest takeaway that I got was that, Joe Schoen, with the responsibility that he has with this team, with the power that he holds with this team, making decisions like this, he was never really going to do it, right? He was never really, you never felt, he never gave you any sign, any hint that, all right, maybe if I offer him this, let's just keep Saquon. You know, he's done so much for us, let's just keep him. He never really gave me that feeling. And this all just but confirmed it based on how close the money was to what the Eagles gave him eventually in free agency. Then they showed what John Mara said about Saquon being their most popular player by far. Then towards the end of that whole interaction, we finally get to the probably the biggest point in the entire series of this Hard Knocks edition, where Ed Berry calls back to Joe Schoen to let him know that they have an offer present to them. He didn't tell them what team specifically offered them this price, but that they did have a better offer and that they were probably going to accept it at the end of the day if the Giants didn't do something about it. Joe Schoen, like you would have expected, just accepted it. You know, he didn't really say too much. He was just making sure that they got a better offer. He realized that they got a better offer, and then after that, he actually asked them if it came from a team within the division. And Ed Berry, from the clip that it showed, didn't tell them at that point, but then the news came out and reality started to set in, and now the Giants had to just move on from that. But again, with how it all played out, you never got a sense that it was going to happen. And from those signs that if you're Saquon in an instance, right? If you're Saquon in this scenario and you keep seeing and hearing from what your agent is telling you and having conversations with Joe Schoen, if he's relaying these messages back to Saquon, I think at the end of the day, with how close these numbers were, if Saquon really wanted to stay a Giant, and this is where I guess I'm kind of defending Giants fans here with how Saquon decided between ultimately joining the Eagles over the Giants, if his agent, which is probably what happened, gave him the numbers that the Giants were thinking of offering, if Saquon really wanted to stay and really wanted to be a Giant, I think he probably could have pressured the Giants into offering him that deal with how close it was to what he eventually got with the Philadelphia Eagles. If Saquon truly wanted to stay a Giant, I think he would have pursued these numbers from the Giants, from general manager Joe Schoen, a little bit more than what he ended up doing. Now, of course, Joe Schoen never really offered it to Saquon. He only just sort of repeated what Ed Berry was saying to him over the phone, and he was thinking about it, but again, you never really got the sense that he was going to offer it. He was going to offer that contract to Saquon, and that's where you got Saquon in his press conference and explaining it on social media that the Giants really never gave him an offer. And now if you're thinking about it as Joe Schoen and actually not pulling the trigger on offering Saquon that money, if I'm Joe Schoen and I see the contract that he got after the fact that I was so close to offering him basically the exact same contract, I'm sick to my stomach. There's a hole in my stomach. I'm feeling just... Think of that realization when you have that contract, almost the exact same thing that you wanted to or were thinking of paying him, and then you lose him and the Eagles offered him probably just exactly the same contract. I can't imagine the feeling. I can't imagine the sense of just weight probably on your shoulders now that Saquon has moved on. Now you have to move on. And you saw the reaction, if you guys saw the episode, from owner John Mara. He sort of just walked away and the camera followed him down the hall and he just looked absolutely defeated. So all of that now, all that pressure added on to Joe Schoen. They obviously had to do something about it now, and it followed the Giants through the rest of free agency. And you saw them and their transactions of acquiring John Runyan, Jermaine Illuminor to their offensive line, Devin Singletary as well. That seemed to be Joe Schoen's guy from the beginning, just because he drafted Devin Singletary to Buffalo while he was there. Then he moves on to Houston. Joe Schoen comes to New York, and then they obviously reconnect here in New York. And it's no surprise that, again, Joe Schoen was a big proponent of getting Devin Singletary in through the door. So now, a pretty brand new team, brand new offense for the Giants with Daniel Jones now. This interaction was just so real in a sense that how close some of these numbers came, and some of these negotiations for some of these massive players can really get to a point where virtually the same contract, but if you show some hesitancy, if you show that you're not really there, Saquon decides to move on and go to the Philadelphia Eagles, and now the Giants, after all of that, we still got a few more episodes to go for this series to be completed, but for them now to move on finally from Saquon and then have that pressure on them now, it's truly going to be this year one of those years where everything almost has to fall perfectly into place, because you have this decision now riding on this entire regular season for you to kind of stand up for yourself and stand up for this decision that in some universe it could be seen as understandable. Now you also have to try and get Daniel Jones to look like a competent quarterback and lead you to similar success that he did in 2022 with this new offensive line, shaping this offensive line to be a lot better than it was. You have new playmakers on the outside. There's a lot of newness where I find a hard time coming to a conclusion where I can see all these situations sort of panning out the way that the Giants wanted to. It's hard for me to believe it just because all these decisions just kind of came out of nowhere. There were big decisions that could ultimately all end up being bad ones. Really, at the end of the day, I think it's too short of a window, really, for them to piece this puzzle together and really convince a lot of their fans, a lot of the New York market to see that this team has some promise going forward. I feel like it's going to just be more of the same. I feel like they just haven't done enough. And compared to the Eagles and even the Cowboys, I'm not high on the Cowboys, but the Giants don't give me much confidence either. So it should be more of the same. The Commanders got better as well. So if anything, the Giants could end up at third at best, if not last in the division. And then everyone's going to come back to these conversations, come back to these decisions on Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll, on how these could have really changed the course of where this team was going. You had something going here with Saquon, a generational talent, but you decided to move away from that and potentially take a couple steps back, which is not ideal, but we're just going to see how everything plays out in 2024. Again, these interactions, conversations you see behind the scenes on Hard Knocks are super fascinating, so I do recommend you guys going to check that out. But that'll be it on this segment and talking about the offensive side of the ball for the Philadelphia Eagles. After the break that is coming up, we're going to talk about the defensive side of the ball for the Eagles and what Darius Slay, their veteran cornerback, had to say on how he's excited and just reacted to some of his first impressions on some of their new acquisitions that they got in 2024. That is coming up in just a few seconds. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
Look